Hello ladies and gentlemen of YouTube, my name is Brad. This is my channel Animate Orange, where I build a lot of 3D metal models and show you how I do it. In this video I am going to review another Metal Earth model, Moloch's Landspeeder from Solo movie, another Star Wars movie, or Star Wars story movie I should say. If you haven't seen the movie, this is a craft or vehicle that's early on in the movie in a chase scene. It's chasing this is chasing Han Solo in his little speeder. This is the speeder that's chasing. It's a boxy looking thing. And a fun and interesting little build with some challenges I didn't quite expect. There was some issues in bending and shaping that I wasn't quite ready for. There was some issues with some unique parts that I wasn't quite ready for. But starting from the beginning, from the top, when you go through the instructions and through the build of this model, the first little mistake that I made and be a little careful for is, I believe it's part 4 on sheet C, has a couple little almost antenna pieces sticking off the side, and I had mistaken those for maybe some leftover from where the part was held on the tree and accidentally clipped them off. Be a little wary of that. You're probably not going to do that, but I did, just from having issues here recently with clipping pieces off, and there's still a little bit of the tab or whatever the connecting piece is that holds it on the sheet is still there, and I like to trim them up sometimes, and I just mistook what I saw for that and clipped it off. So be careful you don't do that on part 4 like I did, but right behind that with part 6, because 3, 4, and 5 come together on top of part 6, and then the sides of part 6 fold over and connect to the larger part. And I did have a little bit of issue with the sides of part 6, and I guess it's the engraving detail on part 6 that weakened the structure or the support of it. One of those flaps, and I honestly can't remember which flap it was, but one of the flaps bent down incorrectly. And you have the fold lines that are engraved in the metal sheets to help you fold those parts down. It does do a lot for helping things fold evenly most of the time, but this one particular side didn't do that, and it just kind of, instead of folding cleanly on the fold line being here and it folding cleanly, it just kind of did like this and folded in correctly. And once that happened, it was very difficult, if not impossible, to undo and straighten back out like it should have been. And I made some attempts, but after a while working with this metal, you don't want to make too many attempts back and forth bending it, because you're just going to break it. So I kind of gave up at one point and just pieced it together as it was and tried to push it down and flatten it out, and it only did so much good. So warning to you, when you get fairly early on in the instructions to part 6, be very careful folding down those edge pieces after you've connected the pieces on top, because they may not want to fold properly. And another little issue that I had, once you get to parts 10 and 11, they're long thin pieces and they curve on the bottom, and it's just the design of the whole ship. And let's see here, I believe one of them is right here and one of them is right here, and they're just little edge pieces that are supposed to curve. But getting the exact right curve, I didn't really know what to guide it by, and being as thin as they are, it was hard to do it properly. Now I got one of those curves pretty close to right. One of those curves did not go close to correct, and it caused me some issues later. There's not a whole lot of tips I can give you to get that curve just right. I used some of the cone shaping and curve tools that I have, and it didn't quite work out because it's such a small short bend. It's hard to get it just right. But for guidance, to kind of get an idea of what kind of curve you're looking at, you might want to look at the bottom of part 13. If you look at part 13, there's the top part, and then it cuts in, and there's the bottom part. The curve that you want to follow is the bottom part. That may help you, and I didn't quite catch that when I was putting it together, because part 13 comes on page 3 farther in before you realize that that's the part you need to line to. But that's a little bit of a guideline. Do your best. You can make some adjustments later on, and I ultimately did get things together, and it did work out. Not as excellently as I'd like to, but it does still come together. But there's not a ton of trick to getting that curve just right. You just kind of have to do your best. The usual tips apply, like on part 15. One end of part 15 you have a tab that folds down, and part 15 is a very long, thin, windy part. In situations like that, it's better to hold down the center piece, or the actual part near the edge where it bends. Hold that part down with a tool, pliers or tweezers, and bend the tab or flap down with something else because it's so thin. It would very easily bend incorrectly if you tried to grab the piece that you bend with the tool and not support the rest of it. You may end up bending it wrong. So that's a pretty standard suggestion, and that particular part, what did I just say, part 15 is one you want to watch out for. But probably the biggest thing that I want to talk about, and this might be more of an issue just for me, but I imagine there's probably a few other people out there that are going to have a similar issue. Being a guy, I have a little bit higher chance to having some issues with color blindness. Now when I say color blind, that does not mean you cannot see any color at all. There's different levels of color blindness, and for me it's telling the difference in shades in some hues like blues and greens and grays. I have a little bit of a difficulty with. Not terrible, but some. I preface what I'm about to say with that because in the instructions, and I appreciate that they're doing this now, but in the sheets, as I've stated in the beginning of a lot of my build models lately, or build videos lately, they color code like parts, and that's excellent that they do that. I greatly appreciate it. But, and I'm going to show you a close-up picture rather than try and hold this in front of the camera. If you look at parts 2, they're kind of a lighter blue, I think. If you look at part 19, it's a very similar shaped part. It's a little bit darker blue or purple, I think. I say I think because to me, on this piece of paper, they look the same. There's a couple of them up top, part 19 and part 2, that are kind of close together, and I can kind of sort of tell a little bit of a difference in the shade since those two are side by side. But the rest of them scattered out, I can't tell which is which. I cannot distinguish between those two shades sufficiently enough. Now, if you look at it closely, you'll easily notice that there's an engraving difference, and that is the big difference between the two. One has a singular circle where the other has two smaller circles in the engraved center area. I noticed that right away, but I couldn't understand why. I thought it was a misprint at first. I thought maybe something had gotten off and there was a miscut, because these aren't printed, these are laser cut, but maybe something had been off-centered and the circle just, instead of it being in the center, there was two side by side by some sort of odd mistake that I just couldn't quite figure out why these same parts had different engravings. They go in different places, obviously they're two different parts, but I didn't realize they were two different parts. I didn't quite work it out. I just kind of dismissed it in my mind as some sort of mistake in the engraving and continued using the parts, but it bugged me. It did bug me enough apparently, because I didn't really look deeply into it until I was done with the model. I get in the zone, I get to working on these models, and everything else kind of melts away sometimes. But after it was all done, I got a closer look and I asked other people to look at it. There are two different colors. I finally figured out, okay, these are two different parts, because you don't go from part 2 to part 19 side by side. The part 2 is on page 2 and part 19 is on page 3, which are completely opposite sides of the paper, and I think I had a little bit of break between the two, and I just didn't catch it. I should have. In hindsight, absolutely obvious, but at the time I just couldn't understand why these same parts had different engravings on them. They weren't the same part. I was getting them mixed up because I was looking for that blue piece. It looked familiar. I had put it on earlier. I had done a blue one earlier. I just didn't quite make out that, well, that was a different part number. They're different parts. It wasn't until later I figured that out. So if you're like me and you have some trouble distinguishing between shades of color, which is honestly just a common guy thing, be careful with that. Here's a warning for you. Part 2 and 19 are different. Look at the engravings. Part 19 is the single circle and part 2 is the double circle, and that comes in probably the biggest difference on this front sort of grill piece here. There's a line of part 19s that I basically put, I don't know, one of them I think is a 19 and two of them are part 2, because I just didn't know what was going on and just moved on with the model thinking it was some sort of interesting metal mistake, engraving mistake that I was going to talk about at the end of the video. No, it was my mistake. So for you, you may not have any trouble at all telling the difference between those two. You may be able to see the color difference quite clearly. I could not. And that's mostly my issue, but I'm pretty sure there's probably going to be others out there with a similar issue, so be careful. Beyond that, it was pretty fun to build. Not a terrible challenge, just challenging enough to be fun. I did have some issues and had to take a few deep breaths with some of the smaller parts, You know, for instance, that one part that I was talking about, the sides didn't fold down properly, but there were some other smaller parts that were just so tiny and so thin that it took a deep breath and extra patience to get them folded properly. There's some things that didn't want to cooperate, but that's kind of always the case. And you know, I talked about these two long thin pieces here and getting the curve right on those, and honestly this large back piece here curves under at the very back in a similar fashion, and it's also somewhat guesswork getting the curves quite right on that. And that's where I had some of my biggest trouble, getting those two parts 2 and 19 mixed up, getting some of the thinner parts folded over properly, and getting the curves on the bottom were the biggest issues that I had. Beyond that, everything come together nice and smoothly and fairly easily. It was a fun build, nice assembly process, nicely designed, comes out with a pretty neat little model. A few little things. This cage up here was challenging to get quite right, and this cage right here turned out a little better than I expected. Those thin pieces like that can be quite a challenge, especially when they're early in the build. You continue to handle them as you put more things together. I straightened out this grill 2 or 3 times, which I don't like to do too much. When a thin piece is sticking off and it gets bent once or twice, I tend to leave it that way until I'm done with the build, because if you straighten it out and then bend it again, straighten out and bend it again, it's going to break. This was not such a sharp bend, so it wasn't that big a deal. Only straightened it out a couple of times. I don't think it's weakened it, so it should be good. This guy took about 3 hours and 15 minutes, 3 hours and 18 minutes, something like that, to put together, clip out all the parts and assemble them. So it's not too bad. It's more or less par for a Metal Earth model, for a Star Wars Metal Earth model. It's right there in the medium difficulty range. And again, this is a model, it did not feel like it took 3 hours or over 3 hours to build. It felt like it took 2, which I consider that a good thing. It wasn't long, boring, and dull and making it feel like it took forever. It went by fairly smoothly, not quite quickly, but smooth enough that it didn't feel like it took as long as it did. So I didn't get frustrated with it. I didn't get tired of it. The amount of detail in this model is pretty much what I've come to expect from the Star Wars Metal Earth models at this point. Lots of little bitty parts to fuss with and put together, but it makes for a lot of detail, especially in this front grille area. There's so many pieces in there, so much detail layered in the front, along the back engine part, and even a couple of things tucked underneath other things. So far I'm enjoying it, and even though this one took a little bit longer than the other speeder, it didn't seem as long. It seemed to go quite a bit quicker. I guess I'll leave it at that. As always, thank you for watching. If you want to watch the full build of this video, I am still doing those. There's a link in the description down below, and I'll put one at the very end here in just a second where you can click on if you want to watch the entire build all the way through. Of course, it's edited down. I'm not going to show every single thing, boring looking through the sheets and clipping stuff off, but it covers most of the details like before. So still, this is a new format. I'm doing 2 different videos now rather than putting it all in one. Review is now separate from the build video, and we'll see how that goes. Leave it at that. As always, thank you for watching. You enjoy these videos, consider becoming a Patreon or Ko-Fi supporter. There's links in the description down below, and a link here in just a second at the end of this video. A little bit goes a long way. Thank you to my supporters for giving me the freedom to continue to build these models and help you and review and help others with their problems as well. Thank you for watching, and keep on keeping on.